11-year-old Maya Rodriguez was just another passenger in seat 7C, reading her book on a routine flight to visit her grandparents. But when terrorists hijacked the plane and the captain desperately called for help, this small girl became the only person who could save 147 lives. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Denver International Airport as passengers filed through Gate B-27, boarding transcontinental flight 447 bound for Washington Dulles. Among the steady stream of business travelers and families, an 11-year-old girl moved with quiet independence, her small rolling suitcase trailing behind her as she presented her boarding pass to the gate agent. The woman smiled warmly at her with that particular expression adults reserve for children traveling alone. Seat 7C, sweetie. The flight attendants will take good care of you. Maya Rodriguez settled into seat 7C with practiced efficiency, stowing her bag in the overhead compartment and sliding into the window seat with her backpack clutched against her chest. She wore simple travel clothes, jeans and a hoodie with a cartoon character that marked her unmistakably as a child. The book she opened was thick, its cover decorated with an illustration that looked like any young adult fantasy novel, and she immediately became absorbed in its pages as the cabin filled around her. A flight attendant named Jennifer paused at row 7, bending slightly to make eye contact with Maya, speaking in that bright, simplified tone that adults unconsciously adopt with children. "Hi there. Are you traveling by yourself today?" Maya looked up from her book and nodded, offering a small smile. "Yes, ma'am. I'm going to visit my grandparents in Virginia." Jennifer's expression softened. "Well, aren't you brave? If you need anything at all during the flight, you just press this button right here, okay?" Maya nodded politely and returned to her book, her eyes moving across pages that, if anyone had looked closely, contained dense technical text about aircraft systems and emergency procedures, all disguised beneath a dust jacket from a popular children's fantasy series. Maya had been 7 years old when her father, Captain Marcus Rodriguez, had died in a training accident, his F-18 going down over the Pacific. She had been 8 when her mother, unable to bear the loss, had followed him in the quiet desperation of sleeping pills and vodka. She had been 9 when she moved in with her grandparents in Arlington, her grandfather a retired Air Force colonel who had taught her father to love flying, her grandmother a former air traffic controller. What no one could see from looking at this small girl was that she had spent the last 4 years immersed in aviation knowledge with an obsession that bordered on pathological, studying her father's old flight manuals, tactical handbooks from his squadron days, absorbing everything with the desperate hunger of a child trying to resurrect the dead through understanding what they had loved. Her grandfather, recognizing her genuine aptitude beneath the grief-driven motivation, had begun teaching her properly. Sunday afternoons found them in his study, working through aerodynamics problems, discussing weather patterns and emergency procedures. On her 10th birthday, he had given her access to a professional flight simulator, and Maya had spent hundreds of hours flying everything from single-engine Cessnas to commercial jetliners, her small hands on controls designed for adults, her mind processing the complex choreography that separated competent flying from disaster. Her grandmother had taught her the other side of aviation, the constant communication between aircraft and ground, the protocols and phraseology that kept thousands of flights from becoming collisions, the ability to maintain calm authority in situations where panic meant death. The Boeing 737 pushed back from the gate exactly on schedule, and Maya's eyes briefly tracked the movements outside her window with attention that went beyond childish fascination. The aircraft rotated smoothly, lifting into the clear Colorado sky, and Maya felt the familiar sensation of gravity shifting as they climbed. No one paid attention to the small girl in the window seat who had returned to her book after watching the takeoff with quiet intensity. The flight leveled off at 37,000 feet, and the captain's voice came over the PA system with the standard welcome, flight time approximately 3 hours and 40 minutes, weather clear, smooth air expected. Maya was deep into a chapter about emergency electrical systems when she felt the aircraft's attitude change, subtle but unmistakable to someone who had spent hundreds of hours learning to detect the smallest variations in flight characteristics. The nose dropped slightly, the engine spooled up, The aircraft was descending though the seatbelt sign hadn't illuminated and there had been no announcement. She looked up from her book, her mind immediately running through possibilities, then she felt the aircraft bank more sharply than any routine maneuver would require, and she saw Jennifer quickly moving toward the forward galley with an expression that wasn't quite alarm but wasn't the calm professionalism of normal flight either. The captain's voice came over the PA, and there was something in his tone that made Maya's stomach tighten. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Harrison. We're experiencing a situation that requires us to divert to the nearest airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for possible emergency landing." The cabin erupted in confused murmurs, and Maya's training kicked in, immediately processing scenarios: engine failure, pressurization problem, medical emergency, fire. Then she heard something that turned her blood cold, a loud bang from somewhere forward followed by shouting, and suddenly Jennifer was running toward the front of the plane and passengers were standing up despite the seatbelt sign. The man in 7B stood up, craning his neck, and Maya heard his sharp intake of breath. "Oh my God!" More shouting from the front, and now Maya could see 3 men who had apparently been sitting in first class now standing in the forward galley area, and one of them had something in his hand that gleamed metallic and wrong. The woman across the aisle screamed, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. Maya's training kicked in with crystalline clarity, shutting down the fear response that was paralyzing the adults around her. 3 hostiles, at least one armed, they had breached or were attempting to breach the cockpit, and given the captain's announcement and the current descent profile, the flight crew was trying to get the aircraft on the ground before the situation escalated. She watched as one of the men produced what looked like a small explosive device, holding it up so passengers could see, his voice carrying through the cabin with accented English. "Everyone sit down. Nobody move. We control this plane now." The second man had forced open the cockpit door somehow, and the third man was yelling at passengers to put their heads down. Maya forced herself to breathe slowly, to think through the panic. Stay calm, assess the situation, identify assets and vulnerabilities, look for opportunities. The hostiles were focused on the front of the aircraft, on controlling the cockpit and keeping the forward passengers subdued. Maya remained perfectly still, her small form pressed against the window in a posture that looked like frozen terror but was actually careful observation. The hostile moving down the aisle reached row 7, and he barked at the businessmen. "Head down. Don't look at me." Then his eyes swept over Maya, and she saw the exact moment when his threat assessment dismissed her as irrelevant, just a terrified child who posed no danger. He moved on without even telling her to put her head down because in his mind she was beneath notice, too young and small to matter. The aircraft shuddered slightly, and Maya realized that whoever was flying now wasn't a trained pilot because the flight was less smooth, the descent profile less controlled. She heard raised voices from the cockpit area, angry and demanding. Then everything changed. The man who had been moving through the cabin suddenly shouted in alarm and rushed forward, and Maya heard a scuffle from the cockpit area. Then Captain Harrison's voice, loud and strained. "Can anyone fly this plane? I need someone who can fly right now." The words hung in the air like a detonation. Maya looked around the cabin with desperate hope, looking for someone, anyone who might have aviation experience, but she saw only frozen terror on adult faces. The hijacker in the aisle had pulled a knife, was shouting at everyone to stay seated, and Maya realized with crystalline certainty that no one was going to respond because no one could, and that meant it had to be her, impossible as that was, because she actually could fly this aircraft, had flown this exact type dozens of times in a simulator, and if she didn't do something right now, everyone was going to die. She unbuckled her seatbelt and carefully stood up, small enough that her head barely cleared the overhead bins, her backpack still clutched against her chest. The businessman hissed at her urgently. "Sit down. Don't move." But Maya ignored him, slipping into the aisle and moving forward toward the chaos. The hijacker who had been patrolling turned and saw her, his face twisting with confusion. "Girl. Sit down." But Maya kept walking, and something in her expression made him hesitate, uncertain whether to physically restrain a child. Maya reached the forward galley where Jennifer was pulling herself up from the floor, blood on her forehead. Jennifer's expression cycled through confusion and alarm. "Sweetie, you need to," but Maya cut her off, her voice clear and calm. "I can fly the plane. I need to get to the cockpit." Before Jennifer could respond, Maya pushed past her toward the cockpit door, which was standing partially open. She stepped into the cockpit, into a space that was simultaneously completely familiar from simulator hours and utterly alien because this was real. Captain Harrison was pressed against the right side of the cockpit, bleeding from his nose and mouth, and his first officer was slumped in the right seat, unconscious. One hijacker was in the left seat, hands on the yoke, turning the aircraft with increasing desperation as alarms began to sound. The man with the explosive device saw Maya and laughed, because what threat could a small girl possibly pose? Captain Harrison's eyes widened with confusion and desperation. "What, you need to get out," but Maya stepped fully into the cockpit. "Captain, I can fly this aircraft. My name is Maya Rodriguez. My father was Captain Marcus Rodriguez, naval aviator. I've been training on simulators for 4 years. I know this aircraft. I can help." The aircraft was now banking past 45 degrees, the overspeed alarm was screaming, and the hijacker in the left seat was clearly losing control. Captain Harrison made a decision that violated every protocol, but he was out of options. "I need you in the right seat, I need you to help me get control back," but the man with the explosives moved, grabbing for Maya, and she did something her grandfather had taught her, a simple Aikido redirection that used the attacker's momentum against him, stepping inside his reach so that he stumbled past her. The hijacker in the left seat turned at the commotion, releasing the yoke, and Captain Harrison launched himself forward, but the hijacker recovered and there was violent struggle over the controls. Maya didn't think, she simply moved to the right seat, climbing into it with practiced movements, her hands immediately going to the yoke even though her feet couldn't reach the rudder pedals. Her eyes scanned the displays, 52-degree bank at 287 knots in a descent rate of 3,400 feet per minute. They had maybe 90 seconds before they exceeded structural limits. Her hands moved with speed and precision, finding the autopilot disconnect, hitting it, then rolling the yoke right to counter the bank, pulling back gently to arrest the descent, throttles back to reduce airspeed. The man with the explosives came at her again, but Jennifer appeared with a fire extinguisher, swinging it and catching him in the shoulder. The aircraft was responding now, the bank angle decreasing, 45 degrees, 38, 31, Maya's hands making minute corrections. Captain Harrison managed to land a solid punch to the hijacker's jaw and took control, his hands working with Maya's in unconscious coordination. "I've got pitch and roll, you manage power and systems," he said in clipped language, treating her like a competent crew member. Maya nodded, her hands moving to the throttles, her eyes scanning the system's displays. Jennifer and 2 male passengers tackled the man with explosives, and Maya's hand moved to the door controls. The reinforced cockpit door swung shut with solid finality. The captain reached for the radio. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, Transcontinental 447, we have been hijacked, 3 hostiles aboard, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable airport." The response was immediate. "Transcontinental 447, Denver Center, roger your mayday, Cheyenne Regional is closest, bearing 035, distance 78 miles, cleared direct Cheyenne, emergency services will be in place." Captain Harrison looked at Maya. "Can you fly heading and altitude while I manage the situation?" Maya nodded, already setting the heading bug. "I've got the aircraft, Captain." There were impacts against the cockpit door, something heavy being used as a battering ram. Captain Harrison grabbed the crash axe and positioned himself by the door while Maya flew on, maintaining heading 035, descending through 21,000 feet. A new voice came on the radio, FBI Special Agent Chen, and Captain Harrison provided rapid-fire details. Maya listened while focusing on the approach to Cheyenne, calculating that at current speed they would be in position to land in approximately 25 minutes. She heard sounds outside the cockpit door, mechanical clicking, and her tactical training supplied the answer: breaching charges. She keyed the radio, and her voice was absolutely calm. Denver Center, Transcontinental 447, the hijackers are placing explosive breaching charges on the cockpit door, approximately 1 minute before breach, current position 40 miles from Cheyenne, requesting immediate priority clearance. The controller's voice cracked slightly. Transcontinental 447, you are cleared for immediate visual approach runway 27, emergency equipment is in position, and Godspeed. Captain Harrison was configuring for landing, and Maya's hands moved to extend flaps, then landing gear. 3 green lights confirmed all gear down and locked. They were on a 5-mile final, perfectly aligned. The sound when it came was catastrophic, the cockpit door blowing off its hinges, smoke filling the space. Through the smoke came 2 figures, one with a knife and one with a gun. Captain Harrison turned to fight them while Maya blocked out the chaos, focusing with laser intensity on airspeed and altitude and glide slope. The altimeter unwound through 3,000 feet, 2,500, the runway huge in the windscreen. Behind her were sounds of struggle, but she kept her eyes forward, kept her hands steady. Passing 1,000 feet, Maya pulled the throttles back to idle, let the descent rate increase slightly, the runway threshold passing beneath them. Her hands moved with muscle memory from 1,000 simulator landings, pulling back gently on the yoke, raising the nose, and then the main gear touched with a firm but controlled impact. She deployed the spoilers and thrust reversers, and the aircraft decelerated with satisfying violence. She had done it. But one of the hijackers broke free from Captain Harrison and lunged for the controls. Maya grabbed his wrist, using a pressure point technique, and the man screamed. Captain Harrison tackled him from behind. The aircraft slowed through 60 knots, 40, 30, and finally came to a complete stop on runway 27 at Cheyenne Regional Airport. Maya set the parking brake with hands that were starting to shake. Outside, tactical teams were surrounding the aircraft. Maya methodically shut down the engines, following the procedures, and then she sat back and realized her entire body was trembling. Tactical operators filled the cockpit, weapons raised, securing the hijackers. A medical team appeared, checking Captain Harrison. One operator looked at Maya with visible confusion. "Captain, did this child?" Captain Harrison pulled himself to his feet with a wince. "This is Maya Rodriguez. She served as my co-pilot and is directly responsible for saving everyone on this aircraft. She can fly better than some pilots I've flown with who have 10,000 hours." The operator looked at Maya again, seemed to struggle with several responses, then simply nodded. They brought a stretcher for Captain Harrison, and as they took him out, he stopped beside Maya's seat. "Your father would be proud, Maya. What you did today, there aren't words for it." Then he was gone, and Maya was alone in the cockpit for a moment. She let herself cry for the first time, quiet tears running down her 11-year-old face. Agent Chen appeared in the doorway, studying her with sharp eyes. "Maya Rodriguez, I'm Agent Chen. What you did today saved 147 lives. You showed courage and capability that most adults will never possess. Before the media circus starts, I wanted to tell you personally, thank you." He stepped aside, and Maya's grandmother appeared, her face a mixture of terror and relief and pride. Maya scrambled out of the seat and threw herself at her grandmother, and they stood there in the damaged cockpit while emergency personnel worked around them and the world tried to make sense of what had happened. Eventually they would evacuate the aircraft, and Maya would be interviewed by federal agents and trauma counselors. Eventually the media would descend, and Maya's face would be on every news channel, the child co-pilot who saved a hijacked airliner. Eventually there would be congressional hearings and FAA investigations and debates about how someone her age could have acquired such skills. But in that moment, Maya was just an 11-year-old girl being held by her grandmother, crying with relief and residual fear. Through the cockpit windscreen, she could see passengers being evacuated onto the tarmac, see Jennifer being helped down, see people hugging each other with expressions of shock and gratitude. She thought about the 147 people who had boarded in Denver expecting a routine flight, not knowing they were about to become participants in a hijacking that would be averted by the most unlikely hero imaginable. Years later, Maya would become Captain Rodriguez, fly combat missions, teach younger pilots the lessons learned from that terrible morning. She would marry and have children and teach them about flying the way her father had taught her. On the 20th anniversary of Transcontinental 447, she would attend a reunion at Cheyenne Regional Airport and meet the now-adult children who existed only because of her actions. Captain Harrison would tell her that the real miracle wasn't that an 11-year-old could fly a 737, but that when he called out asking if anyone could fly, she believed she could. The story of Seat 7C would become legend in aviation circles, the impossible hijacking and the impossible rescue. Maya Rodriguez never forgot the weight of the yoke in her small hands, the terrible responsibility of having so many lives depending on decisions made by someone still young enough to need permission slips for field trips. In the end, the story wasn't just about a child who could fly or a hijacking that failed. It was about the human capacity for rising to impossible challenges, about the ways that tragedy could forge strength, about the moral obligation to use gifts when needed regardless of the cost. They took Maya to the hospital that evening despite her protests that she was fine. The doctors found nothing worse than some bruising and elevated stress hormones, but the trauma counselors insisted on evaluation. She gave statement after statement to federal agents who recorded every detail, walking them through the crisis with precise attention that most adults would lack. They asked about her training, and she told them about her father, the simulator, her grandparents' aviation background. She watched them try to understand how an 11-year-old could have acquired this knowledge, this capability, this fearlessness in the face of violence. Her grandfather arrived from Virginia that night, having chartered a private plane to get there as fast as possible. When Maya saw him walking into the hospital room, she saw in his face every complicated emotion, pride that his training had worked, guilt that she had needed it, relief that she was alive, horror at what she had experienced. He hugged her with fierce gentleness. "Maya Bean, I don't know whether to ground you for life or nominate you for a medal. What you did was brave and reckless and brilliant and terrifying." Maya hugged him back, breathing in the familiar smell of his cologne, and she felt safe for the first time since the hijacking began. They smuggled her out through a service entrance to avoid the media gathered out front, and drove to a hotel where the FBI had arranged rooms. Maya finally got to shower and change, then sat on the bed wrapped in a towel and turned on the television even though she knew she shouldn't. There she was on every news channel, footage of her descending from Transcontinental 447, looking small and scared and impossibly young. The Chirins read, 11-year-old girl lands hijacked plane, and child hero saves 147 lives. Aviation experts were expressing disbelief, explaining that even with simulator training, an 11-year-old shouldn't have been able to fly a commercial aircraft, shouldn't have had the physical strength or cognitive capability to process the complex systems. The next morning, Agent Chen returned with news. The 3 hijackers were in custody, 2 injured but all expected to survive and face federal terrorism charges. The explosive device had been real, sophisticated, capable of destroying the entire forward section if detonated. The FBI had identified the men as part of a cell with foreign terrorist connections who had been planning the operation for months. The first officer was recovering from being tasered, suffering a concussion and burn injuries. Captain Harrison had 3 broken ribs and a fractured cheekbone but was stable and asking about Maya. Jennifer the flight attendant had needed stitches but was otherwise okay. 2 passengers had been injured during the cabin struggle, but everyone had survived. Agent Chen explained that Maya would be called to testify multiple times, that there would be intense scrutiny of how an 11-year-old had accomplished what she did. Her grandparents could file for protective orders to keep her name from official reports, but Chen suggested it wouldn't matter much because enough people had seen her and would leak information. Better to control the narrative themselves through one official interview. After discussing it, her grandparents agreed, and that afternoon Maya sat across from a respected aviation journalist and told the complete story of Transcontinental 447 from the perspective of Seat 7C. She talked about noticing the change in the aircraft's attitude, about seeing the hijackers breach the cockpit, about making the decision to respond when Captain Harrison called for help. She explained her training, gave credit to her father's legacy and her grandparents' teaching, described the hundreds of simulator hours. She was honest about being terrified, about the violence she witnessed, about the moment she wasn't sure they would make it. The journalist treated her with respect, and when they finished, he told her she had done something that would be studied for years to come, that she had probably changed aviation policy permanently. The interview aired that evening, and Maya watched herself trying to explain the unexplainable. The FAA opened an investigation into how Maya had acquired her training, though inquiries were quickly dropped under public pressure that recognized the absurdity of punishing the people who had saved 147 lives. Transcontinental Airlines released a statement praising Maya's actions, offering lifetime travel benefits and establishing a scholarship fund in her name for young people interested in aviation. The pilots' union issued a more cautious statement, acknowledging her heroism but emphasizing this didn't set a precedent for minors in cockpits. Congress announced hearings on aviation security, and Maya was invited to testify. She returned to school 3 weeks later, and it was awkward and overwhelming. Her classmates looked at her differently now, with awe and confusion and sometimes resentment. Teachers didn't know how to treat her. She found herself isolated, separated by experience from peers who worried about homework while she processed trauma. 6 months after Transcontinental 447, Maya testified before Congress in a packed hearing room, speaking clearly about the security failures that allowed the hijacking and the need for better protocols. The hearing made headlines, this 11-year-old lecturing adults about security policy, and Maya learned to ignore both praise and criticism. She also testified in the criminal trial of the hijackers, identifying them in court, describing their actions, reliving the trauma for the jury. When the guilty verdicts came back on all counts, Maya felt a measure of closure. Captain Harrison stayed in touch, calling every few weeks to check in. He told her he was retiring from commercial aviation after 27 years, unable to walk into a cockpit without seeing that door exploding inward, but he would work as a flight instructor, teaching the next generation. He credited Maya with reminding him why flying mattered. A year after the hijacking, there was a reunion at Cheyenne Regional Airport where passengers and crew gathered to commemorate their survival and thank Maya. She didn't want to go, but her grandparents insisted. She was surrounded by people whose lives she had saved, people who told her what they had been doing when the hijacking started, what they thought they were going to lose, how they had gone home to families they hadn't expected to see again. Jennifer was there with her daughter, crying and saying that every time she looked at her child she thought about Maya saving her life. The businessman from 7B told Maya he had started volunteering with youth aviation programs, inspired by her example. The woman from 7D brought her newborn baby, born 8 months after the hijacking, and told Maya she had named her Hope because that's what Maya had given her that day. Maya listened to these stories and tried to absorb that her actions had rippling effects beyond the immediate saving of lives, that 147 people had gone on to live months and years that wouldn't have existed without her, that children had been born and marriages had happened because of 20 minutes in a cockpit when she was 11 years old. Captain Harrison spoke at the ceremony, talking about that impossible morning when he saw an 11-year-old girl climbing into the co-pilot's seat, how his first thought had been that he had failed completely. But then he had watched her fly, seen her hands move with confidence across controls designed for adults, heard her voice stay calm when grown men were panicking, and he realized that age was only one measure of capability. He said she had taught him that preparation and passion could overcome almost any limitation, that if he had to choose a co-pilot from everyone on that aircraft, he would still choose the child reading in seat 7C because she was the only one truly prepared. The ceremony ended with 147 balloons released into the Wyoming sky, one for each life saved, and Maya watched them rise and thought about how fragile everything was, how close they had all come to ending, how many tiny decisions had combined to create survival instead of disaster. Her grandfather put his arm around her shoulders. "You're going to be okay, Maya Bean. It's going to take time, but you're going to be okay." And he was right, mostly. Maya did heal, slowly and imperfectly, through therapy and time and the gradual building of a life beyond Transcontinental 447. Maya carried that understanding through her entire life, knowing that she had been exactly who she needed to be, and that 147 people existed because an 11-year-old girl had closed her book in seat 7C and decided that, "Can anyone fly this plane?" was a question she could answer with yes. When Maya turned 16, she earned her private pilot's license on her birthday, becoming one of the youngest licensed pilots in the country. The examiner who tested her said afterward that she flew with the precision of someone who had been doing it for decades. By 18, she had her commercial license and was accepted into the Naval Academy, following in her father's footsteps. Her grandfather attended her commissioning ceremony, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched her receive her officer's commission. At 24, Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez earned her wings of gold as a naval aviator, flying F/A-18 Super Hornets from carrier decks. Her squadron mates called her 7 Charlie, in honor of that seat on Transcontinental 447, and the nickname stuck throughout her military career. She flew combat missions with the same calm precision she had shown that day in Cheyenne, and her commanding officers wrote fitness reports that praised her exceptional judgment under pressure. On the 10th anniversary of the hijacking, Maya returned to Cheyenne Regional Airport for another ceremony. This time she wore her Navy dress whites, now a lieutenant commander with ribbons that told their own story of service and sacrifice. She stood on the same runway where she had landed Transcontinental 447, and she placed flowers at a memorial that had been erected to commemorate the event. The plaque listed all 147 passengers and crew, with a simple inscription, "When courage was needed most, it came from the smallest among us." That evening, Maya visited her father's grave at Arlington National Cemetery for the first time in years. She knelt in the grass and finally spoke the words she had been carrying since she was 11. "I understand now, Dad. I understand why you loved flying so much. It's not about the aircraft or the altitude or even the freedom. It's about being part of something bigger, about using what you know to protect people who depend on you. I did that once, and I've been doing it ever since." She touched the cold marble of his headstone. "I hope I made you proud."